When I record these lectures, I don't usually have a theme. I think the only other lecture I made with a theme was the one on the Etruscans, who deserve more credit. So, you are in for a treat because in this lecture, I do have a theme. And you want to know what that theme is? Squares. Did you know that squares can be super interesting and exciting and emblematic of the dynamic modern experience all at the same time? Neither did I until I became an art historian. So get ready to learn about squares. Now, in many ways, this lecture is a companion lecture to the previous one on Cubism and Futurism. The importance of Cubism in the history of art, really in my mind, cannot be understated. It was so influential to subsequent styles in encouraging them to focus on approaching art from an intellectual and analytical perspective, while also encouraging abstraction, which is the mainstay of modern art. Abstraction in geometric terms, I should clarify. We're going to cover two styles in this lecture, both predicated on these Cubist-inspired concepts. The first is the Russian style of Suprematism. The second is the Dutch style of DeStijl. See? I told you squares can be really exciting. Suprematism, this was a very influential Russian style that exists during a time of pronounced transformation. Think about the dates of the style, 1913 to the late 1920s. So, this is on the doorstep of World War I, which began in 1914, and this style was being practiced during the Russian Revolution of 1917. The founder of the group is Kazimir Malevich, who created the work you see here. He's considered to be the first Russian avant-garde artist to create a truly non-representational work of art. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, let's think about this name, Suprematism. What's it all about? It's based on the concept of the supreme, right? Suprematism, supreme. And with this idea of supreme, it's referring to the notion of the superior. Now, according to Malevich himself, this style represented, and I quote, the supremacy of pure feeling or perception in the pictorial arts. That's kind of lofty, so I'll say it again. Supremacy of pure feeling or perception in the pictorial arts. Basically, what he's saying is that feeling and visual experience are the most important. Now, how is this achieved? So Malevich's goal was to, and I quote again, free the painting from the burden of the object. Okay, let's think about this. To free the painting from the burden of the object. He found realism and representation to be distracting, right? Because remember, he's looking at purity. So by taking away the obligation that a painting had to represent anything at all, the viewer is now instead able to focus entirely on formal issues. Subject matter is essentially clutter. If you strip all that away, you're left with the more pure components of the artwork, which were essentials such as space, shape, color. Now, the production of Malevich's supremacist paintings have been divided into three stages. The first stage, black, which we see here, black square set against a white ground. This is one of 4 versions he made of this, what you see here, between the years of 1915 and 1930. He found these black square paintings so profound that he promoted them as the beginning and the very foundation of this entire artistic movement. And it said that these paintings he felt were so profound, so important to him, that one of the versions was carried behind his coffin during his funeral. Now, the second stage is red or colored. Ready to see an example? 8 red rectangles. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, okay, I get the idea of freeing the painting from the burden of having to represent something, but why a square in particular? It's a good question. Malevich chose the shape because he saw it as a universal symbol, something everyone could understand and recognize. That the language of color and shape was intuitive. That we all understand what makes a square a square. Its squareness is universal. Now this piece that belongs to the second stage, this is Malevich starting to get kind of wild. He's moved outside of squares to work with 8 red rectangles of varying sizes placed at varying angles. It's so dynamic how the rectangles make all these diagonal lines that imply motion. They create a sense of tension and excitement as the simplicity of the composition and the white background emphasize the spatial relationships between the shapes. They angle towards each other. Like this right here is so great. This kind of slight angling in towards this rectangle here. So dynamic. They're barely touching. But you want to know the best part of this piece, I think, of everything here? This right here. This barely touching of the corner, right? So dynamic and creating this really nice sense of tension. Now, just when you thought things couldn't get more exciting, we still haven't even looked at the third phase of suprematist painting. Are you ready to have your mind blown? Here it is. White. White on white. This represents the final stage of production, the apex, the apogee, where Malevich achieves what he has been working towards in the previous 2 stages. Remember, Malevich is prioritizing this feeling of purity, the supremacy of color and shape revealed through essentials. I don't think we can get more pure or more essential than a white square on a white background. The point of this is, again, to strip it all away so that all we can do is look and feel. Not even so much think. To finally understand the true essence of the world. Have you ever wondered what's the point of it all? Why are we all here, living our lives day in and day out? All you need to do to get these answers is look at this painting, and you'll understand the meaning of life. Thank you, Malevich. White was not only meant to be a representation of the concept of purity, but also of concepts of infinity and the ideal, the perfect as well, where white is like a void, which I see perhaps as an antidote to a world in chaos. A world in chaos during pre-World War I, during World War I, during the Russian Revolution of 1917. This painting to me is a moment of silence, a facilitator of peace, and again, it's still so exciting and so dynamic with the diagonal lines. And again, I'm into it. These pieces here that almost just quite touch the edge of the composition. What we're seeing here is the true contribution is the institutionalizing of the use of squares in modern painting. Malevich really is the first painter to position this shape as a route to abstraction and as the very emblem of modernity. His influence was great and his legacy lives on, so much so that I like to call him the father of squares. At any point moving forward, when you see a painting of a square, send a little word of gratitude up into the afterlife to Malevich for being the first to show us all the way of the squares. Now, the utopian spirit and the ideals of suprematism, this idea that art can impact the human spirit in profound ways, was found not only in Russia, but was present in the style known as DeStijl that came out of the Netherlands. DeStijl is Dutch for the word style, so a very creative name, and it was a movement that was jointly developed in 1917 by the artists Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg. The style began initially as a set of ideas, which were published by Mondrian in the name of a magazine that had the same name, DeStijl. And eventually these ideas that were outlined in writing began to be executed in image. The DeStijl artists believed that World War I had ushered in a new age, and it was something that these artists were actually really optimistic about. So it's kind of a new thing. And their argument was, though, that if we've got this new epic upon us, that it means that a completely new form of art was needed to capture that unique spirit. Most artists who work in these highly abstracted or non-representational styles, they don't typically start out this way with this really conceptually complicated work. It's usually a process, a working up to. I want to just point this out. And I think Mondrian's a good example of this. He's the most well-known of the DeStijl group, and he makes tons and tons of works that look just like this, and we're talking about him. But let's ask this question of, how did he get to this place of using all of these squares? Let's look at some of his earlier work. Now, he started out pretty conventionally in terms of style. He worked with themes of nature. Take a look at the work on the left, Gray Tree. If you had to guess, I'm doing this for some review, if you had to guess, which style would you say he initially worked in? So maybe pause for a minute, take a look, seek out the clues. Now, if you're struggling, let me give you a hint. Okay, look at the subject and look at the brushwork. The answer to this question, Postimpressionism. These brush strokes to me are really similar to what we saw with Cézanne and his Mont Sainte-Victoire series. Now, things start to change, though, when Mondrian moves to Paris in 1912, and he's exposed to Cubism. Now, the title of Pier and Ocean indicates that he's still focused on themes that surround nature, but now he's starting to work with the Cubist grid structure. He's starting to geometricize. He's starting to simplify. He's starting to take abstraction farther down the path towards non-representation. He's starting to flatten. Now, as his work develops, we're going to see that he continues even more so to push this new trajectory in his art making, reducing the work down even further to simplify rigid lines and these grids. And he gets to the point where even the referential titles that denote subject began to disappear. Let's look at what happens when he gets to this place. Right? His work is very emblematic of modern art. You've probably even seen some version of this before, right? And this really is the culmination of Mondrian's artistic quest. And he bases his work, when he gets to this place, on ideas that he terms as neoplasticism, which translates to new image or new form. Now, he can say it better than even I can, so let me, in his own words, read to you what Mondrian describes as neoplasticism. Here's what he says. The new plastic idea cannot take the form of a natural or concrete representation. This new plastic idea will ignore the particulars of appearance, that is to say, natural form and color. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color, that is to say, in the straight line and the clearly defined primary color. Now, if you're thinking, what the heck did he just say? Don't worry, because I am going to break this down for you in very simple ways. So, basically what he's doing, first of all, is he is re-articulating Malevich's argument. This idea that painting should not be held prisoner to the expectation of representation. He's saying that reality is intangible, and it can be depicted not through an object, but really only effectively depicted through the dynamic interaction of color and form. Also, like Malevich, He's really into this idea of aesthetic purity, and that the key to attaining this is neoplasticism. Now, for him, purity is derived from total simplification. Now, this is the same as Malevich, right? Now, Malevich, his purity is squares, right? That kind of moved to this point where it's a white square and a white background. It's not quite as simple with Mondrian, because he is bringing in shape, line, and color. And all three of those are working in tangent. Now, the simplification of Mondrian's work is established by a set of strict rules. Okay, 3 of them. Number 1, only primary colors. Now, primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. They're colors that exist on their own. They're not created by mixing colors. Now, I brought in a color wheel. You don't need to memorize this or know it, but just to show you color relationships. Okay, red, blue, yellow. Those are primary colors. Again, colors, in theory, that mix on their own. They're not colors that exist by mixing other colors. Like, for example, green. Green is a secondary color. Green, which we see right here, is mixed by mixing the primary colors of yellow and blue. Oops, right here. Yellow and blue make green, right? Now, then you might be thinking, well, what about yellow-green and this blue-green? Those are called tertiary colors. Tertiary colors are mixed by putting together a secondary and a primary. So yellow are primary, green are secondary, make a tertiary yellow-green. Again, you don't need to know that. Just showing you color relationships so that you can see that in Mondrian's work, only primaries. The purest of the colors, existing in their own right, red, blue, yellow. Okay, now, only 3 values. Okay, now value refers to light and dark, right? Black, white, and in very limited instances, gray. Now, black and white technically aren't colors. Where do you see black and white on the color wheel? Nowhere, because they're not colors. They're achromatic. Now, I'm okay if you want to refer to them as colors. I'm not going to lose sleep over that. But technically, when we're talking about these rules that Mondrian's outlining, we're referring to them as values. Only black, only white. And if you want to get crazy, maybe a little gray. Finally, only analytical lines that go in only 2 directions. So yeah, that's like 2 rules right there. Only analytical lines, only in 2 directions. And what are those directions? Horizontal and vertical. These are the rules. This is it. This is all you're allowed to do with neoplasticism. Now, these rules are pretty strict, and the result is a pretty consistent set of images. These grid-like paintings of intersecting lines that create geometric fields of primary color. It's very limiting, and it can get a little bit redundant. No offense to Mondrian, but when you've seen one of his works, you've kind of seen them all. Maybe this red square is smaller. Maybe there's 2 red squares. But otherwise, it pretty much looks similar. Now, with the DeStijl focus on the grid, with their incredibly structured paintings, it's no surprise that we're going to see these styles' principles being applied to architecture as well. Now, the co-founder of DeStijl, as you know, was Theo van Doesburg. Now, he was better known for his architecture, which he based on his theory of elementarism, which was based off of Mondrian's theory of neoplasticism. Now, elementarism was van Doesburg's attempt to modify neoplasticism just a little bit, to not make it so strict, to allow the style of DeStijl a little bit of more variety. He was still into the grid system. He's still into geometric shapes, but one of the main arguments was that every now and again, a diagonal line is okay. He also argued that architecture was probably the more effective avenue to express DeStijl ideas because it offered the viewer a total experience, because they could be completely surrounded by its design. Now, you know the writing's on the wall with this one. This got Mondrian, who was a painter, by the way, pretty burned up. You know, to say that architecture is superior to painting is one thing, but to allow for a diagonal line, that is an unforgivable transgression. And over this matter, Mondrian quits DeStijl in 1924. What we're seeing here is the Café Lobet. And this was like a sort of complex. It was a cafe, it was a dance hall, it was a theater. And Van Doesburg received the commission to particularly design the cafe portion, which the interior we see on the screen. Now his design, as you can see, is clearly a three-dimensional rearticulation of the DeStijl features that we've been looking at in Mondrian's painting. But it's a little bit different because this is in the style of Van Doesburg's elementarism. Now, elementarism is not a turning away from DeStijl. The features abound, and we can see it in here. We've got these grids that reduce the design down to line, to shape, to color. But you've got those controversial diagonal lines, right? And they totally do add a little something extra visually to the grid. They make it more dynamic. They make it more exciting. Especially this, how the grid extends up the wall and onto the ceiling. Yes. So it really is the best of both worlds. We have something spicy with diagonal lines, but we still have this like rigid geometry that denotes these notions of simplicity and purity. And I don't know, maybe it's a sort of middle finger to Mondrian. Not only are there diagonal lines, but did you notice this? Green, which is a secondary color. To keep with this theory that architecture provides an all-encompassing experience, we have a total integration of design and architecture, where Theo van Doesburg doesn't just design the walls, but he designed every single aspect. The furniture, the light fixtures, the hardware, even the ashtrays. And this concludes the lecture on squares.